Nós, estudantes de Relações Internacionais da PUC São Paulo e integrantes do Grupo de Estudos sobre Conflitos Internacionais, em parceria com o Democracy Now!, apresentaremos as notícias da semana.
A partir de agora, vincularemos com legendas em português os principais destaques internacionais.
From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
Joking about public lynchings and hangings is beneath any run for the Senate. I'm not talking about Democrat or Republican, I'm talking about morality now. We know that saying that you want to suppress the votes of college students is beneath what we are called to be in this country.
Will Mississippi elect its first African-American senator since Reconstruction, or will the state return to office a woman who attended a segregationist high school, talked about a public hanging, and posted a picture on Facebook of herself wearing a Confederate soldier's hat and holding a rifle? She captioned the photo, "Mississippi history at its best." We'll speak to the Reverend William Barber about Tuesday's runoff Senate election between Senator Cindy Hyde-Smith and Mike Espy. Then the Trump administration attempts to bury an alarming report that directly contradicts the president's denial of climate change. The major report, which was released on Black Friday, concludes climate change will only worsen and could shrink the U.S. economy by as much as 10% by the end of the century. We'll speak with one of the report's authors, Christy Ebi, as well as Bill McKibben of 350.org.
Climate change is the thing that we'll never, ever get another crack at, you know. The years that we waste here are years that are tipping us into a kind of permanent climate chaos. And we should stop acting surprised when bad things happen as a result.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In Tijuana, Mexico, U.S. Border Patrol officers fired tear gas Sunday on a crowd of desperate Central American asylum seekers as they tried to push their way through the heavily militarized border with the United States. Among those attacked were mothers and small children who were left gagging and screaming as tear gas spread. Mexican federal police officers in riot gear moved in and arrested dozens of the migrants. Mexico's government says they'll be deported to Central America. The group had broken away from a peaceful protest of thousands of migrants demanding entry to the U.S., where they hope to win asylum. The migrants are from Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador and are fleeing widespread violence, poverty, and mass unemployment. This is 37-year-old Honduran asylum seeker Saul Hernandez.
Yo le digo al señor presidente de Estados Unidos.
My message to the United States president is not to scare people, because he's showing Mexico that he has the military power. He's also frightening Mexico. Please remove your troops.
In response, the Trump administration temporarily closed the San Ysidro border crossing, one of the busiest ports of entry in the world, with more than 90,000 people crossing each day. Meanwhile, the administration of Mexican President-elect Andrés Manuel López Obrador denied it had made any deal with the Trump administration to force asylum seekers to remain in Mexico while their U.S. asylum claims are processed. The denial contradicts tweets by President Trump in a report in the Washington Post on Saturday. In Tucson, Arizona, a jury has found Border Patrol agent Lonnie Swartz not guilty of involuntary manslaughter for shooting and killing 16-year-old Jose Elena Rodriguez through the U.S.-Mexico border fence in 2012. The jury hung on whether to bring a charge of voluntary manslaughter, leaving it unclear whether prosecutors would seek to try Swartz a third time. A previous jury acquitted Swartz on murder charges, but deadlocked on lesser manslaughter charges. Authorities claimed Jose Elena Rodriguez was throwing rocks at agents over the border fence before Swartz opened fire, but medical examiners say Jose was shot as many as 11 times, with all but one of the bullets striking from behind, leading them to conclude the teen was shot in the back as he lay on the ground. This is Jose's mother, Araceli Rodriguez, and his grandmother, Taide Elena, speaking just after the verdict last Wednesday.
Le dieron They are giving him back a certification to keep killing, because if they declared him not guilty after having killed a teenager with 10 bullets in his body, they are giving him a green light and permission to continue killing.
What happened here was an injustice because this is a crime more clear than water, and I still cannot understand how they can say the man is not guilty when the evidence is so clear. Right now, one is left with anger, feeling helpless, disillusioned with the laws of the United States.
Last week's verdict came after President Trump said soldiers deployed to the border could use deadly force and after he suggested soldiers could respond to migrants throwing rocks with gunfire. In North Carolina, ICE agents arrested a Mexican immigrant Friday after he emerged from a Durham church where he'd been living in sanctuary for nearly a year. 47-year-old Samuel Oliver Bruno had gone to the ICE office in Raleigh to have his fingerprints taken so he could apply to remain with his wife and son in the U.S. After Oliver Bruno was taken into custody and placed in an ICE van, his supporters surrounded the vehicle, singing and praying for 2 hours before police moved in to remove them. Among those arrested was Oliver Bruno's son, Danielle Oliver Perez, who was charged with assault on a government officer. The White House quietly released a major new climate change report Friday that seems to directly contradict its own environmental policies. The congressionally mandated study by 300 scientists across 13 federal agencies warns human-driven climate change threatens to shrink the U.S. economy by as much as 10% by the end of the century. It details how the consequences of climate change are hitting on several fronts, including increasing wildfires, crumbling infrastructure, worsening air quality, failing crops, and more frequent disease outbreaks. The more than 1,600-page National Climate Assessment was made public by the White House on Black Friday, causing many to question the timing of its release. Later in the broadcast, we'll speak with the report's lead author, Christy Ebi, along with environmental leader Bill McKibben of 350.org. In California, the death toll in the state's deadliest ever wildfire has risen to 85, with nearly 300 people still reported missing, as firefighters say they finally contained the 150,000-acre so-called Camp Fire. Their efforts were helped by much-needed rain, but the storms have slowed the work of recovery workers looking for human remains. In Ukraine, Russia's Navy captured 3 Ukrainian ships Sunday as they tried to enter a narrow waterway separating the Russian-annexed Crimean Peninsula from the rest of Russia. Ukraine says 6 of its sailors were injured when the ships were fired on, then boarded near the Kerch Strait, which separates the Black Sea from the Sea of Azov. It's the biggest escalation in tensions between the two countries since Russia invaded and illegally annexed Crimea in 2014. Ukraine's president, Petro Poroshenko, called a meeting of his war council Sunday and asked Parliament to impose martial law. The decision could delay March's presidential election when the highly unpopular Poroshenko is seeking re-election. President Trump's continuing to deny the CIA's findings on the murder of Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi. The CIA reportedly found with high confidence Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman was directly involved in ordering Khashoggi's killing. This is Trump speaking Thanksgiving Day.
So the CIA, Mr. President, concluded with confidence that
they didn't conclude. No, Josh, they didn't conclude. I'm sorry.
So you're saying they did not?
Josh, no, they didn't conclude. They did not come to a conclusion. They have feelings certain ways, but they didn't have the report.
Democratic and Republican lawmakers have since rebutted the president's claims. This is Congressmember Adam Schiff, the top Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee, speaking Sunday on CNN.
I have been briefed by the CIA, and while I cannot discuss the contents of the briefing in any way, I can say that I think the president is being dishonest with the American people.
The Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi entered the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, Turkey, October 2nd, where he was murdered by Saudi agents. Saudi Arabia has acknowledged the murder, but continues to deny involvement of the Saudi royal family. In Yemen, a United Nations envoy has arrived in the port city of Hodeidah, hoping to restart peace talks aimed at ending a war between Houthi rebels and the U.S.-backed Saudi-led coalition, which has sparked the world's worst humanitarian catastrophe in half a century. The UN's urging warring parties to meet for peace talks in Sweden next month. In the United Arab Emirates, British academic Matthew Hedges has been pardoned. Hedges, a PhD candidate at Durham University in the United Kingdom, was imprisoned for months without charge, denied sufficient medical and legal assistance, and held for prolonged periods in solitary confinement. Last month, the UAE charged him with spying. Hedges has denied the charges. The European Union has approved a Brexit agreement outlining the terms for the United Kingdom's withdrawal from the European Union in March 2019. This is European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker speaking with the BBC.
This is the deal. This is the deal. I'm never changing my mind day after day. This is the best deal possible for Britain. And this is the only deal possible. So if the House would say no, we would have no deal.
British Prime Minister Theresa May still has to get the deal approved in British Parliament, where members of both her Conservative Party and the opposition Labour Party have publicly condemned the agreement. In France, over 100,000 people took to the streets across the country Saturday in ongoing protests against mounting fuel prices, calling for French President Emmanuel Macron to resign. Some 8,000 protesters gathered in the capital, Paris, where 5,000 police officers were deployed. Protesters and police clashed on the Champs-Élysées, where police used tear gas and water cannons on protesters. 19 people were reported as injured. 40 people were arrested. People marched in cities across the world over the weekend to mark the International Day for Elimination of Violence Against Women. Marches took place in countries including Greece, the Dominican Republic, Ecuador, Italy, Spain, and France, with some bringing out tens of thousands of people demanding an end to sexual violence, domestic violence, and the suppression of reproductive rights. In Pakistan, authorities arrested Muslim cleric Khadim Hussain Rizvi and over 1,000 of his supporters in a crackdown on protests over the recent acquittal of a Christian woman previously sentenced to death for blasphemy. Asia Bibi was released last month after originally being convicted in 2010. Massive protests followed the release, led by Rizvi's Tehreek-e-Labbaik party, disrupting major cities and thoroughfares across Pakistan. In more news from Pakistan, 3 militants attacked the Chinese consulate in the southern port city of Karachi on Friday, killing 2 police officers and 2 civilians before the attackers were shot and killed by security. The Baloch Liberation Army claimed responsibility for the attack. The group has been fighting Pakistan for independence for the province of Balochistan and the southwest of Pakistan. China's building a major corridor through Balochistan as part of its multi-billion-dollar investments in the region. In Afghanistan, the Islamic State claimed responsibility for a suicide bombing at a mosque at an area army base in the eastern Khost province that killed at least 27 soldiers on Friday. The attack came just 3 days after a suicide bomber targeted a religious gathering in Kabul, killing at least 50 people and wounding more than 80 others. Back in the United States and Alabama, protesters marched at a mall where 21-year-old Mantic Fitzgerald Bradford Jr. was shot and killed by police Thursday. Police officers responding to the shooting at the Riversace Galleria Mall in suburban Birmingham fired on Bradford after falsely believing him to be responsible for the shooting, which left 2 injured, including a 12-year-old girl. The gunman's still at large. Bradford's family say they were not notified of their son's death and found out through social media. Bradford was carrying a licensed gun at the time of the shooting, which is permitted by Alabama law. In Charlottesville, Virginia, jury selection begins today for James Fields, the self-described neo-Nazi charged with killing 32-year-old Heather Heyer and injuring 35 others. 21-year-old Fields is charged with first-degree murder for plowing his car into a crowd of anti-fascist protesters at last year's deadly Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville. And Ray Hill, a co-founder of Pacifica radio station KPFT in Houston, Texas, died Saturday of heart failure. He was 78 years old. After his release from prison in 1975, Ray Hill helped organize Houston's first gay rights groups and the first national March on Washington for lesbian and gay rights in 1979. As general manager of KPFT in 1980, he created The Prison Show.
Radio station KPFT in Houston proudly presents The Prison Show on Friday nights between 9 and 11 o'clock. It talks about the biggest industry that eats up your tax dollars, Texas prisons.
Ray Hill hosted the prison show for 20 years, combining news with on-air phone calls from families and friends so they could speak to their loved ones behind bars. Ray Hill's tombstone will reference his proudest achievement, a U.S. Supreme Court ruling in 1987 that he was unconstitutionally arrested for interrupting police officers performing their duties after he yelled at them to stop beating a man in his front yard. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
It is a vote to demand that the humanitarian crisis in Yemen be addressed. It is a vote that will tell the despotic dictatorship in Saudi Arabia that we will no longer be part of their destructive military adventurism.
For the first time in U.S. history, the Senate's voted to advance a bill to withdraw military forces from an unauthorized war using the War Resolutions Act. Could this lead to the end of U.S. support for the Saudi-led bombing of Yemen? That's resulted in one of the worst humanitarian crises. We'll get the latest. Then, as Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman visits Argentina for the G20 summit, Argentine prosecutors are considering prosecuting him for crimes against humanity, including the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. He could be arrested since Argentina's constitution recognizes universal jurisdiction for war crimes and torture. Plus, as global carbon emissions rise for the first time in 4 years, we look at the link between climate change and meat consumption with British writer George Monbiot.
The livestock industry is inherently no more sustainable than the fossil fuel industry. The footprint of the global transport sector is pretty well the same as the footprint of animal agriculture.
George Monbiot became a vegan several years ago. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The Senate's voted to advance a resolution ending U.S. involvement in the Saudi war on Yemen. This marks the first time in U.S. history the Senate's voted to advance a bill to withdraw military forces from an unauthorized war using the War Resolutions Act. 14 Republican senators joined Democrats in the 63-37 vote. This is Republican Utah Senator Mike Lee, who co-sponsored the bill.
This is a war of bipartisan creation. A Democratic president has gotten us involved in a civil war in Yemen. We now have a Republican president. That war has continued. It was started and it has continued without the involvement of the Congress, without the approval of the Congress, without a declaration of war or an authorization for the use of military force by the Congress. That's not okay.
The Saudi-led war on Yemen has created what the UN calls the world's worst humanitarian crisis, with 14 million of Yemen's 28 million people on the brink of famine. A recent report by the charity Save the Children estimates 85,000 children under the age of 5 have died from acute malnutrition brought on by the war. Prior to the vote, Defense Secretary James Mattis and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo held a closed-door meeting with senators to defend the U.S. backing of the Saudi war in Yemen. Mattis and Pompeo also briefed senators on the murder of the Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi last month inside the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. The officials doubled down on the idea there's no direct evidence tying Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman to Khashoggi's murder. This is Defense Secretary Mattis speaking with reporters.
We have no smoking gun that the Crown Prince was involved, not the intelligence community or anyone else. There is no smoking gun.
Have you listened to the tape?
No, I cannot understand that language, but I have spent more than enough time in service of our country. I know what grim circumstances can be. I needed to see what was said, and I read the translations of what is alleged to be the tape. We do not have the tapes. We do not have the tapes. At least I'm not aware that we do.
Secretary Mattis's remarks came one day after National Security Advisor John Bolton also told reporters he did not plan to listen to the tape of Khashoggi's murder because he doesn't understand Arabic. President Trump has also said he won't listen to the tape, calling it a suffering tape. But CIA Director Gina Haspel has heard the tape, but was reportedly blocked by the White House from briefing senators yesterday. The CIA has concluded with high confidence that Crown Prince bin Salman is directly implicated in ordering Khashoggi's murder. A number of senators called out Haspel's absence. South Carolina's Senator Lindsey Graham, a longtime Saudi and Trump ally, said, quote, "This is BS. I want the CIA to come to brief me." He threatened to abstain from any key votes in the Senate until senators receive a CIA briefing on Khashoggi's murder. In more news from the Senate, Republicans have again shut down a vote aimed at protecting Special Counsel Robert Mueller's Russia probe. Republican leadership has repeatedly said such a bill was not necessary and that Mueller's investigation into possible collusion of the Trump campaign with Russian agents during the 2016 presidential elections is not under threat. Meanwhile, President Trump is saying a pardon of his former campaign chair, Paul Manafort, is not, quote, off the table. This comes as Robert Mueller is accusing Manafort of violating his plea agreement by lying to investigators in the Russia probe. The New York Times has also reported lawyers for Manafort briefed the president at the White House about Manafort's cooperation with Mueller's investigators. Some legal experts say this could amount to obstruction of justice or witness tampering. Tensions continue to escalate between Russia and Ukraine after Russia captured 3 Ukrainian ships over the weekend. Ukraine has asked NATO and Germany to send ships to the Sea of Azov. On Monday, Ukraine imposed martial law in parts of the country. Meanwhile, Russia reportedly plans to send more long-range missiles to the region. This is Russian President Vladimir Putin.
There is obvious evidence of a provocation prepared in advance and devised as a pretext to impose martial law in the country. It has nothing to do with attempts to settle relations between Russia and Ukraine. This game is meant to increase tensions. This is foul play on internal policy in order to suppress political opponents.
A Kremlin spokesperson has said a planned meeting between Putin and President Trump at the G20 summit in Argentina is still set to go on Saturday, after Trump indicated Tuesday he may cancel following Russia's confrontation with Ukraine. Trump's set to arrive in Argentina today. Back in Washington, D.C., the Senate's voted to advance Thomas Farr's nomination for a lifetime federal judgeship in eastern North Carolina. Vice President Mike Pence broke the 50-50 tie after Republican Senator Jeff Flake of Arizona joined Democrats in voting against the former protege of Senator Jesse Helms. Civil rights groups widely condemned the vote. This is Reverend William Barber, who spoke to Democracy Now! Monday about Farr's nomination.
Thomas Farr is connected to white nationalism, connected to Jesse Helms. He's been at the forefront of every racist voter suppression law that's been pushed in this state the last 25 years, and
in other news from Capitol Hill, House Democrats have voted overwhelmingly to nominate Nancy Pelosi to become House Speaker, a position she held from 2007 to 2011. She'll face a full House vote in January. A number of Democrats had called for new leadership, with 32 members withholding their vote for Pelosi, though she ran unopposed. Democrats also voted to return Maryland Congressmember Steny Hoyer to the post of Majority Leader and South Carolina's James Clyburn as House Whip. New York Congressmember Hakeem Jeffries was elected chair of the caucus, beating out Congressmember Barbara Lee of California. Lee said after the vote that sexism and ageism contributed to her loss. In Afghanistan, U.S. airstrikes killed at least 30 civilians in Helmand province, according to reports by local officials and residents Wednesday. At least 16 Taliban fighters were also reportedly killed in the attack. Hours later, a suicide bomber and several gunmen launched a coordinated attack near a British security compound in the capital, Kabul, killing at least 10 and wounding 19. The attacks came as Afghan President Ashraf Ghani spoke at a UN meeting in Geneva, Switzerland, where he outlined plans for peace talks with the Taliban. The number of under- and malnourished people around the world is increasing, due in part to climate change, according to a new UN report on world hunger. Around 11% of the world's population is currently malnourished, and countries that are most exposed to major changes in climate have higher rates of malnutrition. The report also states that the number of extreme climate-related events, such as extreme heat, droughts, floods, and storms, has doubled since the early 90s. In media news, the right-wing TV broadcaster Sinclair Broadcast Group is facing widespread criticism after forcing local news affiliates to run a segment defending the tear gassing of asylum seekers on the U.S. border. The piece was a commentary by Boris Epstein, Sinclair's chief political analyst and former Trump aide.
Dozens of migrants attacked U.S. border enforcement by throwing rocks and bottles. Ultimately, American authorities had to use tear gas to stop the attacks. Some on the left, such as Democrat Congresswoman Maxine Waters, were immediately up in arms about our president and his team standing up for our men and women in uniform and for our national security. The fact of the matter is that this is an attempted invasion of our country.
After the segment caused major public backlash, Sinclair released a statement saying the opinions expressed in the segment do not reflect the views of Sinclair Broadcast Group. The Senate has delayed voting on the nomination of Ron Vitiello to head the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency. Vitiello, who currently serves as the acting ICE director, has come under fire for refusing to rule out future family separations at a hearing earlier this month. He's also been called out for a 2012 tweet in which he said the Democratic Party should be renamed, quote, Neo-Clanist Party. This comes as a new report from ProPublica reveals families are still being separated at the border months after the policy was supposedly reversed. A sweeping new report by the Miami Herald lays out how Trump Labor Secretary Alexander Acosta helped billionaire Jeffrey Epstein avoid potential legal repercussions for sexually abusing and trafficking dozens of underage girls. The report reveals Acosta, then a U.S. attorney in Florida, offered Epstein a plea deal in 2008, allowing him to serve just 13 months and avoid a federal trial. The deal put an end to a FBI probe into the case and granted immunity to any of the crime's co-conspirators. It's unknown how many girls Epstein abused overall, though the Miami Herald identifies about 80 women who allege they were sexually abused by Epstein from 2001 to 2006. A survivor of the abuse, Courtney Wild, told the Miami Herald, quote, Jeffrey preyed on girls who were in a bad way, girls who were basically homeless. He went after girls who he thought no one would listen to, and he was right, unquote. Jeffrey Epstein was a wealthy hedge fund manager who was friends with former President Bill Clinton, President Donald Trump, Prince Andrew, and others. In New York, the office of a Jewish professor at Columbia University was vandalized Wednesday with anti-Semitic graffiti. Professor Elizabeth Midlarsky, who researches the Holocaust, said she found large swastikas and the slur Yid spray painted outside her office. This is the latest in a string of anti-Semitic attacks in New York City. Earlier this month, anti-Semitic graffiti prompted the cancellation of an event hosted by Broad City's Alana Glazer at the Union Temple in Brooklyn. In more health news, life expectancy in the United States declined from 2016 to 2017, the third consecutive year a decrease has been observed in a pattern unseen since World War II. The decline is due to an increase in drug overdoses and suicides. A record 70,000 people died from overdoses last year. Drug overdoses linked to the use of fentanyls, highly addictive synthetic opioids, increased more than 45% in 2017. Drug overdoses are the leading cause of death for adults under 55. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
Nosso programa fica por aqui. Você pode acompanhar a gente pela página no Facebook ou pelo blog Terra em Transe.
Nos vemos na próxima semana. Até lá!